Well, hi guys. Hi. Good afternoon. Today on Victory in Europe Day. My name, not to get too Australian about it, is James Kingston. I am a travel curious guide, and I'm here enjoying lockdown from the comfort of my flat here in central London. We're here, as you guys will know, to talk about Victory in Europe Day. I would be out pacing the streets, walking through Whitehall and Buckingham Palace and various other places of the great day. But of course, such is not the case in our very peculiar times. So welcome. My plan for the conversation would be to chat a little bit about the context of VE Day, what went on, some of the stories therein, to discuss a little bit some of the main people involved, where they were on the day, the kind of things they did, and then also really to talk about what VE Day has come to mean. Because there is, of course, VE Day itself, and then there is the story of VE Day, which I think is pretty interesting. So I'll just wait for a bit more of you to join, and then I will, as I've been instructed to do by the Travel Curious team, pin more details on Travel Curious just there. Thank you, Caroline. You see, I didn't forget. I think they were worried, but I haven't. Cool. So for those of you who have just joined, my name is James Kingston. I'm a Travel Curious guide. Done a lot of work with Travel Curious. It's been a pretty great time knowing the team. They're people very committed to travel, very committed to new experiences and helping people learn. And that's been something, as someone with a deep interest in history, having graduated from Oxford in history and politics, I've always been very keen to see and participate in. Now, as many of you guys will know, perhaps some won't, this particular tour/lecture, really, because it's just a tour of my living room, comes under the Stay Curious initiative that Travel Curious has been running. It goes without saying that today's a pretty peculiar time for the travel industry. So Stay Curious is really a great initiative to enable guides such as myself to keep on connecting with people, keep on sharing their knowledge and experience. This is what I've been doing. There's a whole roster of other tours that have been done. I think there was quite a cool one in Venice that I saw when I was looking on their site a couple of days ago. Please, by all means, check it out on that link that I pinned. So, without any further ado, I'd like to start talking to you about the exciting day in question, Victory in Europe Day. It's a pretty interesting day. I was, and it's fascinating to consider quite how much the world has changed since then. What was happening on the 8th of May, 1945? Well, in order to really appreciate and understand that, we need to have a little bit of a look at the context. This had been, wrong shot. This had been, can you guys all see that? Believe me. This had been Europe in 1941. You'd had the gigantic rise of Hitler's Germany, conquering the entirety of the map and sweeping aside states stretching from France through to Poland and really striking at the very core of Russia itself. After years of gigantic warfare, tens of millions dead in Europe alone, and of course even more casualties around the rest of the world, and immense privations on all sides, the Nazis were completed. This once mighty empire, led by the lights of a perverted science, as Churchill so famously said in his Blood, Sweat and Toil speech in May 1940, had been reduced by this time 75 years ago to this size. You can see here how Germany, crushed by the pin raising a glass of cognac, in some cases vodka and others. And, people knew that the war was beginning to end. But it didn't really start to end in a sort of more formal setting until the 30th of April, 1945. For that was the day that Hitler finally committed suicide in his bunker. I see I'm getting some notes that my connection is bad. Let me change. Hello, I've returned, hopefully with better internet. Does that work for you guys a bit better? Excellent. Well, I'll proceed as though it was. So yes, on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide, shooting himself in the bunker, as well as chomping down on some arsenic, also shooting, of course, the dog Blondie, which is very sad. I don't know if any of you have seen the Mitchell and Webb show and their truly excellent sketches, but it does commemorate quite very well what happened next, which is that Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was head of the Navy, took over as command of the German Reich. If you haven't seen, yes, indeed, there are other theories, but no, he did shoot himself in the bunker. Karl Dönitz then became Führer. He only had it for a week, thereabouts. He primarily devoted it to trying to maintain the precedence of his governance, but also really to making sure that German troops could flee the advance of the Russians and go into captivity in the Allied camps rather than the Russians, knowing full well that German troops who fell into the hands of the Russians would be liable to become basically forced labour for the next several years, as happened to several 100,000 of them. On the 4th of May, he officially surrendered northeastern Germany and Denmark, which was under German control, to the Allied commander of that region, Field Marshal Montgomery, who was, of course, a British commander. On the 7th of May, you had the overall surrender led by Eisenhower, who later became president, of course, the American who was overall command of the Western Allies. Not to be outdone, Stalin wanted his own surrender ceremony, so he demanded another one in the 8th of May in Berlin, in the shattered city. And so, the war was finally at an end. Now, of course, by the 8th, people had known the game was up. With the death of Hitler, the binding force behind the German regime had disappeared. His strange, cultish dominance was now no more. And of course, with the surrender from the 4th, people knew that there was no longer going to be any fighting. So one of the interesting things reading the memoirs of troops at this time is how often they just stopped shooting. You read some things of young British soldiers watching German soldiers about half a mile away on a bridge, just in a farmhouse, totally able to shoot them dead, and neither side choosing to participate anymore. So by the 8th, VE Day as we now celebrate it, anticipation was very high. In fact, in a lot of places in Britain, the parties had already started. There was bunting out in the streets. There was lots and lots of very happy people. You had preparations for street parties such as these. Crowds were thronging into city centres. Indeed, in Newcastle, the great northeast English industrial city that would have provided so much of the shipbuilding weight, as well as the coal transportation that would have underlain the industrial war effort for the British, many of the pubs were in fact closed on the 8th, on VE Day itself, because quite frankly people had just drunk it dry. So what was the London to which this VE Day happened? Well, it was a proud city, of course. It was the centre of a great empire that had won in this titanic struggle. But it was, of course, also a place that had suffered a great deal, as you can hopefully see on the picture there. Even though we had this image of proud defiance, St. Paul's, the cathedral, rising amid the smoke, the reality was a semi-broken city. Great swathes of the centre lying ruined due to the bombing of the Luftwaffe. The people themselves looking exhausted. As Noel Coward said in his diaries, a great diarist, that man, I do recommend checking out his diaries if ever you have time, a tired city full of tired people. The privations of war had really been very stark. There had been rationing, there had been the evacuations, All of this was really contributing to this tired out feeling. So, people were very excited. It was indeed going to be the party of the century, as someone observed just a few minutes ago. Knowing this, the government began to prepare. So Churchill, of course, the Prime Minister, he held a meeting on the 7th, knowing that there was going to be the big party on the 8th that had been set. He actually had to get assurances from the Ministry of Food that London had enough beer, because he was afraid that it could just be completely swept aside. As the 8th began, in this great day of jubilation, there was just the most incredible carnival atmosphere. Whenever you read the stories of what people are up to at that day, it always is quite wonderful, the joy and the relief that they felt. For so many, of course, they were still afraid that they might have been called to fight. Others were simply enjoying the chance to get out and about after, all the many lack of freedoms that had been forced upon them due to wartime conditions. As soon as the day started, people began thronging towards the city centres. You had hundreds of thousands of people on the move. You could not even get into the underground, such was the crush of people. People walked, cycled, hopped onto buses, often overloaded buses and cars. So you'd have maybe 10, 20 people hanging on top of a single car as it slowly moved its way into the city centre. You had people really rushing to the pubs as early as they could. I was reading one account recently of two land girls. In fact, let's look at their photo to show you just a scene of the joy. Where has the photo gone? Yes, so there was a great party atmosphere. If we look at these two, so this is a very famous wartime photo. All these young servicemen and women thronging into the centre. Now here is of course Trafalgar Square. You can see here these two sailors with these two girls. I was reading the account. So a few years ago, people decided to find out who were these girls. What had their story been? They were two English girls, and they'd decided to see what they thought was going to be an incredible party. They'd seen photos, in fact, of what the parties at the end of World War I had been, and they determined that they weren't going to miss it out. So they made their way into the centre of London on someone's car. They got in there, and as they firstly went for a drink at the Chandos pub, which is just next to Trafalgar Square. It remains there today, if you ever want to go and have a look at it. They spent ages trying to find drinks. It wasn't the problem, contrary to what Churchill's worry was that it wasn't that there was not enough booze. It was in fact that there was not enough glasses. The throng of people was such, and also, of course, the wartime use of glass had been such that there simply wasn't enough. So people just started refilling their own glasses and handing them around. So two strangers gave them refilled beer from their own glass, handed it to them, and then they drank. It is a great pub. Yes, thank you, Fitzpatrick. So then they went over and were immediately grabbed by these two sailors who started splashing around and throwing them into the water. So they grabbed these sailors. Firstly, one of these sailors, in his excitement, dived off the plinth that you can see there into the 2-metre high water. The girl who was being interviewed in her old age later said she was surprised he didn't die. Splashed her immensely in doing so, and then to get revenge, they grabbed him and his other friend and started thrusting them in and out of the water, like on their back, like this, with everyone sort of laughing and screaming. And so the carnival atmosphere continued. There really was this great sense of just complete freedom and relief. People dancing in the streets. There's records of Canadian soldiers in particular in Trafalgar Square and in Piccadilly as well, entertaining the crowds whilst they waited for the speeches of the day by dancing constantly and playing the music. Now, of course, there's a few things to bear in mind. Firstly is just quite how long people have been living under wartime conditions. So what the psychology of this would have been. 6 years. And prior to that, a decade of deep economic depression. So they're entering it like that. And this is also a much more constrained society, much more bound by what we now see as old-fashioned rules of modesty and politeness. So people were really going completely wild as far as they were concerned, with the dancing in the streets, saying hello to random strangers, shaking hands, kissing people they'd never met before. It's actually interesting. If you read some accounts, not a few marriages were made that night. I was reading one account from an old lady who said she had gone into the centre, that she was a wren, so had been contributing to the effort on the home front and the land, and she was there in Piccadilly Circus, and a man kissed her, and she turned to look at that man who she'd never laid eyes on before, and then they hung out for the rest of the party and ended up being married for 63 years. So there was a great sort of, sense of excitement through it all. Now, in terms of the main, I guess, well, and here's indeed a great photo just showing that throng. So here's in Trafalgar Square, and you can really see just how much people were packing in. All the more important, of course, because there just simply would not have been such great public occasions like this for the 6 years of the war, given the threat, firstly, of the bombing, of invasion, then the bombing, and then, of course, until really very late into the war, the risk of the doodlebugs, as they were called, the V1 and the V2 rockets that the Germans were sending in from places in northern France and the Netherlands, and then other places along the coastline, which were a very great threat. One of the many interesting and peculiar things about this, of course, was, just as a complete by the by, I recently found out whilst doing research that the British government actually knew it was influencing, because it had broken the Enigma codes, it knew where the Germans were going to send the rockets to. So they had their double agents actually feeding subtly fake launch coordinates to the Germans. So the Germans were constantly trying to strike Westminster, around here, of course, where Trafalgar Square is, because of the prevalence of government officers, perhaps even wanting to, kill Churchill himself and the rest. But the British double agents kept on subtly changing the subtly changing the coordinates, and then monitoring how those are received using the Enigma machine by the German High Command. The upshot of this was, or the downshot, depending on how you look at it, was that the bombs kept on moving slightly further east, protecting the government, but sadly, of course, meaning that more and more of the East End was devastated, even through the war's later stage. So an interesting example of the slightly cold calculations that governments have to make in those times. So what was then the course of the day? Well, there was all sorts of parties. People went around to one another's houses immediately and had on the radio and were drinking and having fun. The street parties, I've already shown you a photo of one. Let's show you a photo of another one. I quite like this one. Here you can kind of see actually the living conditions that a lot of people, particularly in East London, those that hadn't been bombed out, would have been living in, the quite narrow, old-fashioned tenement streets. But everyone really coming together and making what they could out of the very limited resources they had at their disposal. Because, of course, everything was rationed. They had to use their ration coupons to get the goods needed for it. And there's stories of people, to celebrate the occasion, having the rarest of goods and commodities for the day. I was reading one account of a young lady who, an old lady now, but she was very young at the time. She was 6, and she realised that something crazy and exciting had happened, because the night before VE Day, her mother, a very archetype of your sort of traditional stiff upper lip 1940s English lady, had to be wheeled home from the pub by her husband, her father, in a wheelbarrow. So she knew that something momentous had occurred if her mother could come home in a wheelbarrow. And they, with her mother sadly rather hungover, they celebrated the great day itself by producing for their 3 daughters 3 strange yellow tubes, which of course the youngest daughter, who was 6 and had been born in the war, didn't know what this was. But the eldest daughter well knew. It was in fact a banana, because people just simply hadn't seen any of these things for so long. So the offering of a banana was something fit to celebrate the greatest victory that Britain had ever seen. In terms of the sort of pageantry of the event? Well, clearly this was a key part of it. The victorious Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he woke up to no doubt a hangover. He'd been partying with some old friends the night before, making jokes, having a relaxed time, entertaining people over the dinner table. He went for lunch with the King and the royal family at Buckingham Palace. And then he went to give an address at Downing Street. He then went to Parliament, I should say, to give an address, where he was cheered to the rafters by the grateful parliamentarians. At 3 p.m, he went to go give his speech from Downing Street, a short, quick speech, which is a sort of brief moment to show. And then he went to the palace, because by this point the crowds were surging in great profusion out over to the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, and we have a couple of photos of it here. This is one of the really interesting moments of this. So people, about 500,000 of them came down Pall Mall and into the palace and started demanding to see the King. And so they went out initially by themselves, but then as a unique honour with Winston Churchill, the great commoner, as he was known. And here, in fact, is an exciting recolorized photo, which I rather like, so you can see the same moment again. There they are, waving out. The crowds kept on demanding the royal family all through this period. They were saying that there was one observer who was watching them who actually said that the royal family were called out by the crowds no less than 8 times over 10 hours, who just sort of stayed there, constantly shouting for them and needing them to come and display themselves for the waving. After a period at the palace, Churchill went down to Whitehall, down, up, all the same. He moved the short distance to Whitehall, where he stood from the balcony of the Ministry of Food and gave his famous address there, where he said that this is the greatest victory in our history, that this would be the proudest moment that the British people could ever have occurred, despite all of the odds they had faced when they stood alone in Europe, only Britain and its empire. And he said to the crowds, you can see them there, this is your victory. And joyously, they shouted back to him, no, it's yours. For his leadership had, of course, been so crucial, especially in the dark days of 1940 and 1941, in terms of making the country come together and fight through it. So he gave his great speeches. We had then the crowd just beginning to sing in unison patriotic songs such as Land of Hope and Glory. And, he actually spoke to them twice. Such was there. Now, of course, it was a somewhat mixed day. You had the ongoing fighting in East Asia. So this is why we celebrate it as VE Day and not VJ Day, Victory Against Japan, which is, of course, a bit later. So there were those who had mixed feelings. There were those who had lost loved ones, and there were those who still had loved ones out east and preparing to fight. But even despite it all, it was a great moment of joy, and the partying carried on all through the night. Soon after this period of speeches of Churchill, the crowd surged once more towards Buckingham Palace. Now, the Queen, as she now is, Elizabeth II, who is just a young princess, had actually been allowed out for the first time to go and see the celebrations, and so she was allowed to sneak out in the company of guardsmen, and was later to be found, actually joined the crowds in looking up at Buckingham Palace, shouting, "We want the King, we want the King." And she said it was one of the happiest moments of her life as she stood there, an anonymous young person dressed in the uniform of I think she was an air watching volunteer in the RAF, seeing the happiness of all the people around them. And this moment is, of course, commemorated in various of the films of pertaining to that era that you can now see. I think there's lots of fascinating things about all of this. I think one of the ones that sometimes reveals, to my mind, just how different the times were. As I was actually reading, is just a very little piece, but they're talking about just how much celebration they allowed. They allowed the pubs to stay open till 12, which of course, in the time of a 24-hour city, albeit not in the pandemic, 12 is relatively early. But yes, the pubs were allowed open till 12, and they could party for as long as they can. And there's images then of people just, asleep after their exertions underneath lampposts and whatnot. Again, one of those things that flags to my mind just the very different expectations and options that people had, given the tribulations of that era. Now, of course, the victory in Europe has been one of the proudest moments of British history and is echoed down in the years since. There has, of course, been many moments of firstly, the direct commemorations of Victory in Europe Day, but also, of course, more broadly of the war. I think it would be little exaggeration to say that World War II, to an extent, represents a kind of modern founding myth for Britain. It's the moment where Britain stood up, did that which was unambiguously right, to defend freedom and defend the world. And in doing so, kind of itself was reborn, because you had, in the sort of the popular narrative, the beginnings of the welfare, the true beginnings of the welfare state, with the NHS being founded shortly after. And this is where it does sort of start playing in an interesting fashion, as we tell these stories and as these stories come to re-influence us. Because Churchill was the great victor of the day. It was his victory. It was everyone in Britain's victory, but he had been remarkable in his leadership to it. But of course, within a few short months, he lost the great election of 1945, and you had the truly gigantic Labour landslide that came in under Clement Attlee, who had been a member of Churchill's United War Cabinet. And they were the people who put in the sweeping reforms to social life and the role of the state, and really made, the kind of modern Britain that we've since evolved from. So you have, on one hand, this great victory, on the other hand, this sort of changing social reality all at the same time. And I think what's been fascinating is how that's been reflected down the years in our commemorations of this. So, if we look, for instance, at the 1995 50th anniversary celebrations, you have the conversations around, how do we celebrate the 50th anniversary? Reading some accounts, the suggestion is that the government at the time had initially not wanted to make it too triumphalist. They hadn't wanted, march past and fly past, because they wanted it to be very pro-European. So, they actually invited the German Chancellor of the time, Helmut Kohl, to Britain. He actually came to hang out. He participated in a Thanksgiving service in St. Paul's, which was the cathedral I showed you a few minutes ago, rising nobly out of the smoke. And that itself was an interesting moment as well, because there had been so much happening with Princess Diana. The royal family had been losing its prestige. So the government hadn't even known if to put the royal family at the forefront of the celebration. So what they did, in fact, was firstly, after a popular outcry, they decreed that they were going to have fly-pasts and whatnot. But then what they decided to do was to make the Queen's mother, the Queen Mum, as she was popularly known, the centre of the celebrations. So she was put forward. And indeed, the crowd appeared to like this. There's records of about 500,000 people in front of Buckingham Palace chanting, "Bring out the Queen Mum, bring out the Queen Mum," because she stood as this example of the wartime years. And as this was going on, there was the military flypast of Spitfires, Hurricanes and Lancasters going overhead. Now, the Spitfires, Hurricanes and Lancasters, I think, are a very interesting imagery of this. You now see them popping up in all sorts of ways. So here is actually an image of the royal wedding between Kate Middleton and Prince William a few years ago. And if you look closely, you can actually see a Lancaster bomber at the top, flanked by a Hurricane and a Spitfire, the two iconic figures that you now have. And you get these appearing again and again and again at moments of commemoration. It's this way that they have become symbols of a particular story that Britain wants to tell itself, which then has particular lessons that British people want to have in it. What's fascinating about these stories is they can be used in so many different ways. You have the story of a Britain that helps the world, that combines internationally and is involved in humanitarian ventures, and you can then use this to justify all sorts of international intervention. You can have the imagery of a Britain that stood alone, and so should again stand alone. There's the famous image, I couldn't find it just before the tour, but of a single soldier standing on the white cliffs of Dover saying, "Very well, alone." This was a very famous picture in 1941, just after the fall of France. It became a very famous picture again in the last couple of years during the Brexit debates, as it was rallied and mobilised as a symbol by the pro-Brexit camp to sort of justify why Britain should be alone, because it had done this before, it had won the Second World War. But of course, one of the things that must be remembered about VE Day and about the war in general was that this was a truly international day. I mentioned earlier the Canadian bandsman playing in the street, because Britain was not alone. Britain was an empire. It had the old dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada. It had the other dominions such as India, which had assembled the largest volunteer army in the history of the world. There was an Indian army of 2 million strong, helping support Britain's effort in the Far East. And then there was, of course, the alliance of the United States. One of the most interesting things about Churchill is, whilst he did lead us in defiance and keep us standing alone, as the story later became, what he was doing was making one of the world's largest empires stand alone, and he was constantly seeking to keep the French in the war. That was his first acts when he joined, and he was also seeking to bring in the Americans. So it's always an interesting one to see how these narratives can move and shift and be realigned. And of course, today, we have, I think, one of the most interesting examples of this again. What would this 75th anniversary of VE Day have been? Well, I think, and yes, indeed, the African dominions too. Thank you, Instagram granners, yes, those places too. What would VE Day have been but for the pandemic? Well, as in this VE Day, the 75th anniversary, undoubtedly there would have been political influences. We could have expected the government of today to want to use this to cast a heroic stamp, to claim the mantle of the legitimacy of the wartime sacrifice for Britain's renewed independence as it heads off buccaneering into the seas. And of course, it would have been legitimate for the government to use this, as it's always legitimate for the government to use history. Historians can disagree, but this is to a certain extent what history is used for by governments, to try and it's a story and a discourse and a set of mythology that they interact with. But that hasn't happened. We're not allowed outside. We're kept inside. So what did the government do? Well, they did the most powerful thing that any government can do at a moment of national crisis, symbolically, if not legally, which is to bring out the Queen. At the moment of peak national anxiety in early April, when the lockdown had first bitten and the Prime Minister was hospitalised, the Queen spoke to the nation from her house I think from her house. I think it was indeed from Buckingham Palace. Oh,
this one.
Yes, there you go. Go on the other speaker there. What was so fascinating about it to me as a student of history was the way she rallied the wartime iconography. What did she do? Well, she spoke of the first time that she had ever spoken to the nation, when she, as a young child, with her sister and their father there, addressed the nation in 1940, addressing the fellow children of this country, thus immediately bringing forth all these connotations of wartime sacrifice and these positive memories of victory. she talked about the armed forces and the workers contributing to the battle here in Britain. Again, to my mind at least, bringing forth the imagery of the home front. And then she said some rather wonderful lines, which I'll read out to you, which is, "I hope in the years to come, everyone will be able to take pride in how they responded to this challenge. And those who will come after us will say Britons of this generation were as strong as any. And that the attributes of self-discipline, of quiet good human resolve, and of fellow feeling still characterise this country." Followed by, in her quavering, very particular received pronunciation, "The pride in who we are is not a part of our past. It defines our present and our future." And there, you can really see the mobilising of this story of victory in Europe and of this great victory and rebirth of Britain being pressed in. How is it she concluded this talk of hers? She concluded it with saying, "Better days will return. We'll be with our friends again. We'll be with our families again." And then she says, "We will meet again." Now, why is that so important and so interesting? Because this is, of course, the title of one of the most famous of the wartime songs by Dame Vera Lynn, who sang songs such as, "We'll Meet Again" and also "The White Cliffs of Dover," both of which were sung repeatedly by the crowds on the day as they stood outside Buckingham Palace and as they stood in Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus and in front of the government ministries in Whitehall. When she says, "We'll meet again," she is conjuring forth this legend of Victory in Europe Day and doing it incredibly powerfully. And today, you can see that happening. As we commemorate Victory in Europe Day on this particular anniversary, we'll be listening to the Queen, who will be giving us a broadcast later this evening at 9. There will actually be a broadcast from Dame Vera Lynn, who is still alive. She was the Force's sweetheart. She was a young girl, I'm not entirely sure how old in 1945, but can't have been any older than her early 20s, who was, made into an icon by the armed forces and would sing to the troops. She's still there, and she'll be singing with the people tonight. Then there is, of course, and here is where, just an interest, sort of contemporary bit, it's where the national story of VE Day links with the internet to quite a fascinating account, which is Captain Tom, who so many of you may have heard of. This is a captain named Tom, as the name suggests, who served in World War II. A few weeks ago, he said that he was going to march up and down his garden on his Zimmer frame in order to raise, I think, about £1,000 for a local charity to fight coronavirus. He's now raised, I forget the precise figure, I think something like 26 million, because this went viral. And it was just seen as a, just an immense moment. And again, why did it go viral? Because he was of the war generation. He was a symbol. So people all started piling into this. There's photos of troops at his house giving him a sort of formal, standby as he parades along on his Zimmer frame. He had 100,000 letters sent to his house. 31 million, thank you, Alex, 31. And he's actually had a flyby from, indeed, the Spitfires and the Lancasters. And this, again, just shows you the inspirational power of this myth. Also, I think in Captain Tom's case, it's pretty bloody inspirational. Fair dues to the man. It's very impressive. But it just shows you the power of this story and the memory of this great victory. Now, that concludes my overall introduction to the day. I'm happy to stay online for a little bit longer if there's any particular questions you might have. I'll also have to work out how to answer the questions, of course, but... Excellent. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. It was a really interesting talk to give. A fun way of spending this slightly peculiar day of national celebration. I think, we should all take a moment at some point today and think about what this meant in the past and the sacrifices that people made to give us the world that we've known. Thank you all very much. I'm going to end this, unless you have any questions. Very happy to answer any last minute questions. All right. Great. Thank you all very much. Now, how do I end this? And let me just thank you, the Travel Curious guys again. So for those of you who might have just randomly popped in, this is a tour I've done through Travel Curious that I do some guiding with. This comes under the Stay Curious initiative, which is a way for Travel Curious to give guides such as myself the chance to talk about where they love and where they know about, and to keep on sharing their knowledge and experiences. And yeah, please stay tuned for more Stay Curious tours, and hopefully see you actually doing, real life tours when this awful pandemic ends somewhat. I saw one question, I'll answer it just before I go, which is from Instagram Mums, which is, did the troops go home immediately? The answer is no. It's actually quite an interesting story. The troops did not go home immediately. They were. It varied from place to place. So firstly, troops were still being sent to the Far East for the assault on Japan, and to reconquer various parts of East Asia that were still under Japanese occupation. Quite a few of these actually had to stay even longer, so there's all sorts of now forgotten histories, such as British troops were involved in pacifying Indonesia for the Dutch briefly before they were driven out by Indonesian nationalist action. This was, of course, a bit of a problem for the British Army, because the troops did not want to be there anymore. Britain was safe, they wanted to go home. So one of the things that actually impacted on all of this was increasingly the government just felt the troops would just refuse to go and do anything. They'd refuse to guard anything, fight. So you had this phrase called demob happy, which if you ever hear a slightly more traditional British guy of an older generation perhaps criticising unruly children, such as I would hear at school, or just people in the office, and they say they are demob happy, this is where that phrase comes from. Right, guys, well, I'm going to shoot off. I suppose as per this, hopefully I'll see you on a tour actually out in London someday, and conclude with those final words of we'll meet again. The pandemic won't be everything. Thanks very much, guys. Hope you had a nice time.